Edward Hale was in the middle of a business dinner when a small voice interrupted him. "Excuse me, sir." He turned to find a little girl with bright blue eyes staring up at him. She hesitated, then lifted her wrist, revealing a birthmark identical to his own. "My mom told me that if I ever found someone with this," she whispered, "he might be my dad." The world around him faded. His past had just found him, and it had his eyes. Edward Hale sat in one of the most expensive restaurants in the city, a place where privacy was guaranteed, and the service was impeccable. The evening was routine, another business dinner, another deal in the making, another night where everything went exactly as planned. He wasn't paying much attention to the conversation happening at his table. His business partners were discussing market expansions and potential acquisitions, but Edward's mind was elsewhere. He had built his empire with discipline and strategy, but lately, he had begun to feel a strange emptiness he couldn't explain. He dismissed it as exhaustion. Swirling the wine in his glass, he let out a slow breath, his sharp blue eyes scanning the dimly lit restaurant. It was filled with the city's elite, politicians, celebrities, and executives like himself. Everything about this place was familiar, predictable. Until a small voice broke through the low hum of conversation. "Excuse me, sir." Edward turned his head, surprised. Standing beside his table was a little girl, no older than 8. She had long, wavy blonde hair that framed her delicate face, and strikingly bright blue eyes that seemed too familiar. She clutched a napkin in her small hands, wringing it nervously. Edward frowned. It wasn't unusual for wealthy families to bring their children to high-end restaurants, but something about this girl was different. She wasn't accompanied by anyone. He glanced around, expecting to see a frantic parent rushing over, but no one came. "Are you lost?" he asked, his voice even but laced with curiosity. She hesitated before shaking her head. "No." "Where are your parents?" She hesitated again. Then, slowly, she extended her small hand toward him. And that was when he saw it. A birthmark. Not just any birthmark, *** birthmark. The same distinct shape, in the same exact spot on her wrist as the one on his own arm. His breath caught in his throat. The restaurant faded into the background. The voices around him blurred. The little girl's blue eyes locked onto his, searching, waiting. Then she spoke again, her voice soft but unwavering. "My mom told me that if I ever met someone with the same birthmark as me, I should tell him." Edward's fingers tightened around his wine glass. His heart pounded in his chest. "Tell him what?" he asked, his voice quieter now. She swallowed, then whispered the words that shattered his world. "That you might be my dad." Edward stared at the girl, his grip tightening around the stem of his wine glass. His mind struggled to process what he had just heard. The words felt surreal, impossible. His daughter? No. It had to be a mistake. He studied her face, searching for something familiar beyond the birthmark. Her blonde waves, her bright blue eyes, there was something undeniable about them. A resemblance he couldn't ignore. The restaurant around him faded into distant noise. The men at his table had gone silent, sensing something unusual, but Edward didn't acknowledge them. His entire focus was on the little girl standing in front of him, waiting for a response. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice lower now, more controlled. The girl hesitated, shifting her weight from foot to foot. She glanced down at the napkin in her hands, as if gathering courage. "My mom told me that if I ever saw someone with this birthmark," she said, lifting her small wrist again, "I should tell him, because it might mean he's my dad." Edward inhaled deeply, his mind racing. There was only one person who could have told her that. "Who is your mother?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The girl's lips pressed together for a moment before she spoke. "Lillian Brooks." The name hit him like a punch to the gut. He hadn't heard it in years, but it was a name he would never forget. Lillian had been someone special once, someone who had loved him despite his flaws. But he had walked away, convinced that love and family would only slow him down. He had chosen ambition. And now, standing in front of him, was the consequence of that choice. Edward pushed back his chair and stood, towering over the small child. His heart pounded, but his expression remained unreadable. "Where is your mother now?" The girl lowered her gaze. Her small fingers tightened around the napkin. She died last month." Edward's chest tightened. Lillian was gone. He hadn't seen her in years, hadn't thought about her in just as long, and now he would never see her again. The finality of it hit him harder than he expected. He exhaled, steadying himself. He couldn't afford to lose control, not here, not now. His attention returned to the girl. His daughter. "What's your name?" he asked. She lifted her gaze, her bright blue eyes full of something he couldn't quite define. "Emily," she said softly. The name echoed in his mind, foreign and familiar all at once. Edward glanced around the restaurant. People were starting to notice the scene. He didn't want to have this conversation here, under the curious eyes of strangers. He looked back at Emily. "Come with me," he said, his voice firm but not unkind. She hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Edward placed a hand on her small shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. His business dinner was over. His entire life had just changed. Edward led Emily out of the restaurant, his mind still spinning. The valet handed him his keys without question, and he opened the door to his sleek black car, motioning for her to get inside. She hesitated only for a moment before climbing in, clutching the seatbelt with small fingers as if unsure of what to do next. He settled into the driver's seat, gripping the steering wheel tightly before glancing at her. She looked so small in the large leather seat, her blue eyes darting between him and the unfamiliar surroundings. "Where have you been staying?" he asked as he pulled out onto the road. Emily shifted in her seat. "With Miss Karen. She's our neighbor. She took me in after," she trailed off, gripping the hem of her dress. "But she said I can't stay forever." Edward exhaled through his nose, gripping the wheel tighter. The idea that his daughter, his child, had been left in the hands of a neighbor after her mother's death made something deep inside him twist. Lillian should have told him. He should have known. He forced himself to keep his voice even. "And before that? Did your mother ever mention me?" Emily hesitated. "She told me you were important. That you were busy. She said, you had your own life." Edward clenched his jaw. He could hear Lillian saying those words, softening the truth so Emily wouldn't grow up resenting a man she had never met. She should have told him. He swallowed the frustration rising in his chest. "Did she ever say why she didn't tell me about you?" Emily shook her head. "No. She just said you weren't ready back then." The words hit harder than he expected. He wanted to argue, to deny it, but deep down, he knew it was true. 8 years ago, he wouldn't have known what to do with a child. He had barely known how to take care of himself back then, too consumed with his career to consider anything else. But now, sitting in the car with his daughter, his daughter, everything felt different. He glanced at her again. "Do you have anything with you? Clothes, toys?" Emily shook her head. "Miss Karen packed a small bag, but I left it there. I didn't know if you'd want me to come with you." Her voice was quiet, unsure, and something about the way she said it made Edward's stomach tighten. "Of course, I want you with me," he said, more firmly than he intended. Emily's head turned toward him, her blue eyes wide with something unreadable. He cleared his throat, trying to shake the unfamiliar weight pressing against his chest. "We'll go pick up your things tomorrow. Tonight, you'll stay with me." She nodded but didn't say anything. The rest of the drive was silent, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Emily watched the city lights blur past her window, her small hands folded in her lap. When they pulled up to his house, a sleek, modern mansion nestled in the quiet outskirts of the city, Emily's mouth parted slightly. "This is where you live?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Edward glanced at the large house, its perfectly manicured lawns and towering windows reflecting the soft glow of streetlights. He had never really thought about it before, but yes, it was big. Cold. Designed for a man who had never expected to share his space with anyone. "Yes," he said simply. Emily stared for a moment longer before nodding. She didn't say whether she liked it or not. He stepped out of the car, walking around to open her door. She climbed out slowly, her gaze still flicking between him and the house. "Come on," he said, placing a hand lightly on her back as he guided her toward the front door. As they stepped inside, the quiet of the house surrounded them. The high ceilings and open space that usually felt normal to him suddenly seemed empty. Emily took small steps, looking around carefully, as if she didn't quite believe she was supposed to be here. "This place is huge," she said finally. Edward let out a short breath. "I suppose it is." She turned to look at him. "Do you live here alone?" He hesitated before nodding. "Yes." Emily studied him for a long moment before looking around again. "It feels kind of quiet." Edward wasn't sure why, but her words settled in his chest in a way that made him uncomfortable. He gestured toward the staircase. "Come on. I'll show you your room." Emily followed him up the stairs, her small footsteps barely making a sound against the polished floors. He led her to a guest room, one of many, though he had never actually used them. The room was pristine, the bed neatly made, the decor minimal. It was functional. Empty. Emily stood in the doorway, looking around. "It's nice," she said, though there was no real emotion behind the words. Edward suddenly realized how unprepared he was for this. The room was just a space. There were no toys, no stuffed animals, no warmth. Nothing that made it hers. "We'll get you things tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to her. Emily nodded, then hesitated. "Can I ask you something?" Edward turned to her. "Of course." She looked up at him, her blue eyes serious. "Are you going to keep me?" His stomach clenched. "Keep you?" he repeated, thrown by the phrasing. Emily shifted her weight. "Miss Karen said she wasn't sure where I would end up. She said you might not want me because you didn't know about me before." Edward inhaled sharply, pushing back the sudden wave of emotion that hit him. "I didn't know about you before," he said carefully. "But now that I do." He crouched slightly so that he was eye level with her. "You're not going anywhere, Emily." Her fingers tightened slightly around the hem of her dress. "Promise?" He held her gaze. "I promise." For the first time since they had left the restaurant, Emily's posture relaxed slightly. She nodded, then let out a small breath. "Okay." Edward stood up, watching as she walked over to the bed and climbed under the covers. She looked tiny against the large bed, but she didn't seem afraid. He turned to leave, but before he reached the door, he heard her small voice again. "Good night, Dad." Edward froze. His grip on the doorknob tightened. He had spent his life building a world where emotions had no place, where relationships were unnecessary distractions. But now, in a single night, everything had changed. He turned his head slightly, his voice quieter than usual. "Good night, Emily." Then he shut off the light, closed the door, and for the first time in years, he realized, he wasn't alone anymore. Edward barely slept that night. He had spent years in control of every aspect of his life, his company, his reputation, his routine. But now, all of it felt irrelevant compared to the fact that, in the next room, his 8-year-old daughter was asleep in a bed that wasn't hers, in a house that had never been meant for a child. He sat in his dimly lit office, staring out at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The glass reflected his own expression, calculating, tense, but beneath it, something unfamiliar. Doubt. He had no idea what he was doing. For years, he had told himself that emotions were weaknesses, that attachments were distractions, that his work was all that mattered. But now, there was a little girl down the hall who had lost her mother, who had spent weeks in uncertainty, and who had asked him, with heartbreaking honesty, "Are you going to keep me?" Edward closed his eyes briefly, rubbing his temples. He hadn't even known she existed. He should have been furious at Lillian for never telling him, for taking away his choice. But what haunted him more was the thought of what Emily must have gone through after losing her mother, waiting for someone to claim her, not knowing if anyone ever would. The idea of her feeling unwanted made something tighten in his chest. At some point in the early hours of the morning, exhaustion won out, and he fell asleep in the chair. When he woke, it was to the sound of faint movement outside his office door. Edward sat up, running a hand over his face before checking his watch. It was nearly 7. He had overslept, something he never did. He stood and stepped into the hallway, finding Emily standing near the staircase, peering over the railing. She turned when she heard him, her bright blue eyes widening slightly. "I didn't know where to go," she admitted, shifting her weight. "I didn't want to wake you up." Edward hesitated, still adjusting to the reality of having someone else in his home. "You can wake me if you need to," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Are you hungry?" he asked after a pause. She nodded again. Edward wasn't sure why he hadn't thought of this earlier. He was used to having his meals prepared by staff or eating at his office, but today was different. "Come on," he said, motioning toward the stairs. She followed him quietly as they made their way to the kitchen. The space was modern and sleek, with stainless steel appliances and marble countertops, more of a showroom than anything that had ever been lived in. Emily climbed onto one of the bar stools at the island, watching him. "Do you know how to cook?" Edward let out a short breath. "Not really." Her lips pressed together, as if she was trying not to smile. "Mom was really good at it." He paused at the fridge, glancing at her over his shoulder. "What did she make for breakfast?" Emily's fingers traced patterns on the counter. "Pancakes, mostly. She said they were easy." Edward pulled open the fridge, scanning the shelves. He found eggs, milk, and a box of pancake mix. He could do this. He had closed billion-dollar deals, he could handle pancakes. He placed the ingredients on the counter, turning to find Emily watching him with mild skepticism. "What?" he asked. She shrugged. "You just don't seem like a pancake person." Edward raised an eyebrow. "What kind of person do I seem like?" Emily tilted her head, considering. "Like someone who drinks a lot of coffee and eats food from boxes." Edward smirked despite himself. "Not far off." He turned his attention to the mixing bowl, following the instructions as best he could. Emily rested her chin in her hands, clearly entertained by his effort. When he poured the batter into the pan, she leaned forward slightly. "Don't flip it too soon, or it'll break." "Are you an expert?" She nodded solemnly. "I watched Mom do it a lot." Edward glanced at her. "Then you'll have to make sure I don't mess this up." Emily's blue eyes flickered with something unreadable. He didn't realize how much the words meant until he saw the slight change in her expression, an almost imperceptible easing of tension. The first pancake turned out decent. The second one was better. He placed the plate in front of Emily and set down the syrup. She picked up her fork, took a bite, and chewed thoughtfully. "Well?" he asked, crossing his arms. "They're not as good as Mom's." Edward let out a small laugh. "Figured." "But," she continued, taking another bite, "they're not bad." He took that as a win. They ate in relative silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time since meeting her, Edward didn't feel completely out of his depth. When Emily finished, she set down her fork and looked at him seriously. "What happens now?" Edward exhaled, setting his coffee down. "Now, we figure things out." Emily studied him for a long moment. "Are you sure you want to?" Edward held her gaze. "Yes." She seemed to consider that, then nodded slowly. "Okay." A single word. But it meant everything. For the first time, she was letting herself believe that she belonged here. And Edward knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't going to let her down. The morning after their first breakfast together, Edward found himself in unfamiliar territory. His life had always been ruled by order, efficiency, and control. But now, there was an 8-year-old girl in his house, a daughter he never knew existed, who had turned his world upside down in a matter of hours. Emily moved through the house cautiously, as if she wasn't sure she was really allowed to be there. She didn't touch anything unless she was told she could. She didn't ask for anything. She was quiet, observant, watching him like she was trying to figure out if he really meant it when he said she could stay. Edward didn't know what to do with that. He had spent his life negotiating multi-million-dollar deals, handling high-pressure situations, and making impossible decisions under tight deadlines. But this was different. This wasn't business. This was real. By mid-morning, he realized they had another problem. Emily had no clothes, no belongings, nothing that made this house hers. So, for the first time in years, Edward found himself walking into a department store. Emily stood next to him, her small fingers gripping the strap of her bag as she looked up at the towering shelves of clothes, shoes, and accessories. It was overwhelming. "Pick whatever you like," Edward said, keeping his voice even. Emily hesitated. "Anything?" "Yes." She bit her lip, looking around again. Edward could see the hesitation in her eyes, the way she shifted on her feet like she didn't quite believe him. "I don't need much," she finally said. "You need enough," Edward countered. "We're not leaving with just one outfit." Emily gave a small nod and started moving slowly down the aisle. She wasn't like most children he had seen in stores before. There was no excitement, no running from shelf to shelf, no grabbing at things impulsively. She was careful. Thoughtful. She picked up a few items, looked at them closely, then placed most of them back. Eventually, she settled on a couple of pairs of jeans, some shirts, a jacket, and a pair of sneakers. Edward frowned. "That's it?" Emily nodded. He sighed. "We'll get more later." She looked up at him with an unreadable expression. "Why?" "Because you need things, Emily," he said simply. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded again. "Okay." After checking out, they stopped at a bookstore. Emily walked through the aisles much more confidently this time, her fingers running along the spines of books. Edward let her take her time, watching as she carefully chose 3. He raised an eyebrow when she handed them to him. "Only 3?" She shrugged. "Books last a long time." Edward exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "We'll come back when you finish these." Emily smiled for the first time that day. Deal. The ride home was quiet, but it wasn't uncomfortable. She sat in the passenger seat, flipping through one of her books, occasionally glancing at him as if she wanted to say something but wasn't sure if she should. When they arrived back at the house, she carried the shopping bags inside, setting them neatly by the staircase. "You don't have to do that," Edward said. "I have staff." "I don't mind," Emily interrupted. She hesitated before speaking again. "Mom always said you should take care of your own things." Edward wasn't sure why, but that hit him harder than he expected. He nodded. She was probably right. Emily gave him a small smile before grabbing her bags and heading upstairs to her room. Edward watched her go, exhaling slowly. He had never considered himself a father. He never thought he would have a child, never thought he would have to think about things like school, books, or how many outfits an 8-year-old needed. But now, standing in his own house, watching his daughter settle into a home that had never been meant for a child, he realized something. This wasn't just about allowing her to stay. This was about making sure she never felt like she didn't belong. And for the first time in his life, Edward Hale understood that some things were more important than business. Family was one of them. That evening, the house felt different. It was subtle, just a shift in the air, in the way the silence wasn't quite as heavy. Edward wasn't used to this feeling. His home had always been exactly that, his. Every detail had been designed for efficiency, for comfort, but not for warmth. Now, there was a child upstairs, a child who was his, and suddenly, the walls seemed less imposing. He found himself in his office, attempting to catch up on work, but the numbers on the screen blurred together. His mind kept drifting to Emily. Was she settling in? Was she feeling out of place? Did she need anything? The fact that he didn't know was what unsettled him the most. After a few minutes of trying and failing to focus, he pushed back his chair and stepped out into the hallway. He hesitated outside her door, unsure if he should knock or just walk away. Before he could decide, the door creaked open slightly. Emily stood there, looking up at him. She wasn't wearing the clothes she had picked out earlier, just a slightly oversized t-shirt that must have belonged to her mother. She held one of her new books in her hands, her fingers lightly gripping the edges. "Hi," she said. Edward cleared his throat. "Hi." She shifted on her feet. "I was going to read for a bit before bed." He nodded. "That's good." She hesitated. "Mom used to read to me sometimes." The words hung in the air between them. Edward felt the weight of them, the unspoken question beneath them. "I could read to you," he found himself saying, before he had even fully thought it through. Emily looked surprised, as if she hadn't expected him to offer. She studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Okay." She walked back to her bed, climbing onto it and pulling the blankets over her legs. Edward followed, sitting in the chair beside her bed. She handed him the book, her blue eyes watching carefully as he opened it. He glanced at the title. It was a children's book, but one with a deeper message, something about courage and finding your way home. He started reading, his voice steady, though he wasn't sure if he was doing it right. Emily didn't interrupt. She just listened. By the time he reached the 3rd chapter, her eyelids had started to droop. She fought against it, struggling to stay awake, but eventually, her breathing evened out, and the book slipped from her hands. Edward sat there for a moment, watching her sleep. She looked peaceful, but there was still a slight crease in her brow, like she was afraid she might wake up and everything would be gone again. A knot formed in his chest. He quietly set the book on the nightstand, then stood up, pulling the blanket up to her shoulders. Before leaving, he hesitated, then, without thinking, he reached out and brushed a stray strand of blonde hair from her forehead. She didn't stir. He stepped back, glancing at her one last time before turning off the light and leaving the room. As he closed the door behind him, a realization settled over him. This wasn't just about giving her a place to stay. She needed a home. A family. And for the first time, Edward knew he wasn't just taking care of a child. He was her father. The next morning, Edward woke up earlier than usual. His internal clock was trained for efficiency, for early mornings and late nights dedicated to work, but today, something felt different. He wasn't rushing to check his emails or preparing for a conference call. Instead, his mind went straight to the small girl sleeping in the next room. His daughter. The word still felt foreign to him, but less so than the day before. He stepped out of his bedroom, pausing at Emily's door. It was slightly ajar, and he could hear soft shuffling from inside. He knocked lightly. Come in, Emily's small voice called. Edward pushed the door open and found her sitting on the floor, carefully folding the new clothes they had bought yesterday. She was organizing them into neat piles on the bed. You don't have to do that, he said. I have someone who can take care of laundry. Emily shrugged. I don't mind. She smoothed a wrinkle from a shirt, her small fingers working carefully, as if the simple task gave her a sense of control. Edward leaned against the doorway. Did you sleep well? Emily nodded. Yeah. She hesitated. Thanks for reading to me. Something in his chest tightened at the quiet sincerity in her voice. You're welcome, he said. I can do it again tonight if you want. Emily looked up at him, her blue eyes widening slightly, as if she hadn't expected the offer. Then she gave a small nod. Okay. Edward watched her for a moment longer before clearing his throat. You should eat something before we go. Emily tilted her head. Go where? Edward hadn't told her yet. He hadn't been sure how she would react. But after last night, he knew what he had to do. We're going to pick up the rest of your things from Miss Karen's. Emily blinked in surprise. Oh. She paused, thinking for a moment. Okay. There was no excitement, no relief, just quiet acceptance, like she had trained herself not to expect too much. That didn't sit right with him. Get ready, he said. We'll leave soon. Emily nodded and went back to folding her clothes. Edward turned and walked downstairs, making a mental note to remind himself of something important. This wasn't just about bringing her things home. This was about making sure she knew it was her home, too. ####. The drive to Miss Karen's house was quiet. Emily sat in the passenger seat, her hands resting on her lap, fingers lightly tapping against each other. Edward glanced at her as they pulled up in front of a modest two-story house. It was warm, inviting, the kind of place where a child should feel safe. Miss Karen was already waiting for them on the porch. She was an older woman with kind eyes and a tired smile. The moment she saw Emily, her face softened. There's my girl, she said warmly. Emily climbed out of the car, hesitating for just a second before walking up the steps. Miss Karen knelt down and wrapped her in a gentle hug. Edward watched from a few feet away, feeling like an outsider in a moment he had no right to interrupt. Miss Karen pulled back, brushing a strand of Emily's hair behind her ear. Are you doing okay, sweetheart? Emily nodded. Yeah. She glanced back at Edward, then turned to Miss Karen again. I think so. Miss Karen smiled but looked up at Edward, studying him for a long moment. You must be her father. It wasn't a question. Edward met her gaze, nodding. Yes. Miss Karen stood, folding her arms. Lillian never told you, did she? Edward clenched his jaw, shaking his head. No. Miss Karen sighed. I figured as much. She wanted to. She almost did, so many times. She glanced at Emily. But she was scared. She didn't think you'd want to be a father. Edward exhaled slowly, glancing at Emily. She was sitting on the porch steps now, hugging her knees to her chest, listening but not interrupting. She should have told me anyway, he said quietly. Miss Karen nodded. Yes. She should have. Silence stretched between them before she spoke again. Emily's been through a lot. She lost her mother. She lost her home. She's been trying to be strong, but she's just a little girl. She paused. She needs you, Mr. Hale. More than you probably realize. Edward's chest tightened at the weight of those words. I know, he admitted. Miss Karen studied him again, then gave a small nod, as if deciding something. Her things are inside. I packed everything she left here. Emily stood up. I can get it. Edward stepped forward. We'll both get it. Emily blinked in surprise but didn't argue. Inside, the house smelled like warm spices, the kind of place where memories lived in every corner. Edward noticed framed pictures on the walls, some of Miss Karen's family, but a few of Emily as well. She had been loved here. They carried out the small bag of belongings, which wasn't much, some clothes, a few stuffed animals, a framed photo of her mother. When everything was packed into the car, Miss Karen crouched down in front of Emily again. You have my number, sweetheart. You can call me anytime, okay? Emily nodded, her expression calm, but Edward saw the way her hands clenched slightly. She was holding back emotions the way he often did. Miss Karen smiled gently. You take care of yourself. Emily swallowed, then wrapped her arms around Miss Karen in a quick but tight hug. Edward looked away, giving them a moment. When Emily finally climbed into the car, she let out a small breath, staring out the window. The drive back was even quieter than before. Edward wasn't sure if he should say something, but after a while, Emily spoke first. She took good care of me, she said softly. Edward nodded, keeping his eyes on the road. I can tell. More silence. Then, after a long pause, Emily turned to him. Are you going to take good care of me too? Edward felt that question like a punch to the chest. He glanced at her, at the way she was trying to sound casual but couldn't quite hide the uncertainty in her voice. Yes, he said, no hesitation in his voice. I will. Emily held his gaze for a moment longer before nodding. She didn't say anything else, but this time, she seemed just a little more relaxed. And for the first time, Edward realized, maybe she was starting to believe it. That night, Edward found himself doing something he had never done before, walking past his office without stopping. His laptop sat untouched on his desk, his inbox overflowing with emails, yet none of it felt urgent. Instead, his focus was elsewhere. Emily was in her room, unpacking the small bag of belongings she had brought from Miss Karen's. She had been quiet since they got back, but not in the way she had been before. This wasn't the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of someone trying to make sense of a new reality. Edward hesitated outside her door before knocking lightly. Come in, Emily said. He stepped inside, glancing around. The guest room still didn't feel like a child's space. It was too polished, too impersonal. But Emily had carefully placed her stuffed animals on the bed and set the framed photo of her mother on the nightstand. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, a book open in front of her, though she wasn't reading it. You settling in? Edward asked. Emily shrugged. I guess. He leaned against the doorframe. I was thinking, maybe tomorrow we could get some things for your room. Make it more yours. Emily looked up, her blue eyes filled with something hesitant. Like what? I don't know, he admitted. Whatever you want. A desk, new bedding, maybe some posters. Emily chewed her lip. I've never had my own room before. Edward frowned. You shared with your mom? She nodded. It was small, but it was nice. He glanced around again, at the cold, spacious room that had been designed for guests who never stayed. Well, this one is yours now. So you should make it feel that way. Emily studied him for a moment, then nodded. Okay. Edward exhaled. Good. She hesitated. Can we get paint? He raised an eyebrow. You want to paint the walls? She nodded. Mom let me pick the color in our old place. Edward had never given a second thought to the color of his walls. They were neutral, understated, carefully chosen by an interior designer. But now, for the first time, he realized that his preferences didn't matter. What color? He asked. Emily tilted her head, thinking. Blue. Edward smirked slightly. Figures. Emily's lips twitched, like she was holding back a smile. They stood there for a moment in silence before she spoke again. "Are you still going to read to me tonight?" Edward blinked. He had offered once, but he hadn't expected it to become a habit. Yet now, as he looked at her, waiting for his answer, he realized he didn't mind. "Yes," he said. "Pick a book." Emily nodded and reached for the one she had been holding earlier, climbing onto her bed. Edward took the chair beside her, flipping to the page she had marked. He read, his voice steady, and as the words filled the room, Emily's posture softened. By the time he reached the second chapter, she had begun to blink slower, her breathing evening out. Edward closed the book but didn't move right away. He watched her sleep, the way her small hands rested against the blanket, the way the framed photo of her mother sat beside her like a quiet reassurance. For so long, he had thought his life was full. His success, his power, his carefully controlled world, it had been enough. But now, sitting here, watching his daughter sleep, he realized something else. His life hadn't been full at all. It had been waiting to be. And finally, it was. This story is not just about a millionaire discovering he has a daughter, it's about redemption, responsibility, and the unexpected ways life forces us to confront our past. Edward Hale begins as a man who believes he has everything. He has power, wealth, and control over his world. But in reality, he is alone, his life carefully structured to avoid emotional ties. When Emily appears, everything he thought he knew about himself begins to unravel. What makes this story powerful is not just Edward's realization that he has a daughter, but his gradual transformation into a father. He doesn't change overnight. There are doubts, mistakes, and moments of hesitation. But with each passing day, he chooses Emily, not out of obligation, but because he wants to. Emily, on the other hand, is a child who has lost so much. She is cautious, hesitant to believe that Edward will stay. She doesn't ask for much, but her quiet hope is what drives the emotional depth of the story. She doesn't need a perfect father, she just needs someone who won't leave. The beauty of the ending is in its simplicity. Edward reading to her at night, helping her pick out things for her room, promising that she is home, these small moments show that love isn't about grand gestures, but about consistency, about showing up. Ultimately, this is a story about second chances. About how sometimes, life gives you something you never expected, and it turns out to be exactly what you were missing. Edward didn't just find his daughter, he found the missing piece of his own life. And for the first time, he truly understands what it means to be rich.